Well, this is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, critical look at Canada's role abroad. We are at about 155 weeks. Um, I am Yves Engler, coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. And I'm going to get right to it because there's a lot of developments in Canadian foreign policy. Um, the CONAI, which is a big indigenous federation in Ecuador, they put out a press release I just saw criticizing the free trade agreement between Canada and Ecuador and saying it's going to be beneficial to the transnational mining companies and the big oligarchs within Ecuador. There's a lot of opposition to this trade agreement in Ecuador. Pitasana, who did the very good series on Canadian foreign policy, published an article a couple of days ago, headline Canada's Foreign Policy Legacy, a Nuremberg Principles Assessment. And it goes over the fact that Chomsky argued that if Nuremberg principles were applied, every post-World War II US president would have faced indictment. And basically, almost every Canadian post-World War II prime minister engaged in actions that aligned with Nuremberg-defined crimes. I posted that to my Twitter. People can check that out. There was a front page of the business section story in the Globe. I think it was last Monday or Tuesday. Headlined Companies with Historic Slave Trade Ties Faced Renewed Calls to Pay Reparations to Canadians of African Descent. And the most important Canadian contribution to the transatlantic slave trade was the cod, principally cod, no, not only, but cod that was sent to the Caribbean slave plantations to keep people working 16 hours a day from the Atlantic, from Newfoundland. And in my book, and they mentioned this in this article, in my book about Canada and Africa, I trace the wealth used to set up the two CIBC and Scotiabank. And the people who were the main players had direct ties to the slave economy in the Caribbean and that wealth. And they mentioned it in the story in the Globe piece, which I thought was interesting. Uh, as we mentioned in previous sessions, there's some positive developments taking place in the Sahel, the Alliance of Sahel States. So Chad apparently just the last withdrew. France withdrew from the last military facility in Chad, and we've talked about the Canadian mining companies that are being uh, challenged in in Mali, Niger, especially Mali. So there's some positive developments on the African continent. It's a sort of nationalist, military-led uh, pushback to French U.S. military power, but also economic. Now, very bad developments in Congo. A few days ago, the M23 and Rwandan forces captured Goma, the city of around 2 million in the east, uh, and um, and they started moving further. Apparently, about 800 or 900 people were killed in Goma. Obviously, hundreds of thousands fled. A few thousand were injured in the fighting. And there's been now hundreds and hundreds of thousands, million plus, maybe even a couple million, that have been displaced due to the fighting over the past 3 years, but especially in the last few weeks. Now, it appeared they killed the Rwandans killed a whole bunch of South Africans, 14 South African troops, I think three Malawian troops, and the um battle between South African officials and Kagame really picked up, all kinds of threats being made by Kagame, and this has a real possibility. And also with Burundi. So Burundi has many soldiers in eastern Congo, um, by the with the will of the government. And Burundian president said that they basically there would be a war if Rwanda keeps going south in Congo. They would basically be at war. So this is the same dynamic as what led to the eight-country war in the late 90s. Rwanda invaded, overthrew the government. When they were then expelled, they reinvaded with Uganda at that time, and it led to a huge, devastating war. So that dynamic is a real possibility. Just today, just a few hours ago, actually, I heard that the M23, and the M23 is really just the Rwandans, of course, that they announced that they were going to stop. They weren't going to keep moving towards Kinshasa. They had threatened to go to Kinshasa, um, which is 1,500 kilometers away. Uh, but they now seem to have decided that this is the whole situation is sort of spiraling, and it could lead to greater South African intervention, Burundian intervention, and uh, and other countries for that matter. That's it's a possibility. So they seem to stop. That's a good thing, of course. Now, the Canadian context, the Trudeau government has backed Kagame a whole bunch of ways. I published a piece on Canadian Dimension that looks at a little bit of that. I did an interview with Judy Rever that looks at a little bit of that. People can check that out on my and the CFPI YouTube channels. And but in the Congo piece, I go into the history and Canada's long history of colonialism, imperialism in the Congo. A very significant history. Overthrow Lumumba, supporting Belgian colonial rule, conquering on behalf of the King Leopold II, missionaries, etc., etc. Now, I think I mentioned this last week, but I'm doing a piece that looks at Romeo Dallaire, and back at the end of November, when I uh, found Romeo Dallaire at the Montreal book, I forget what it's actually, the book festival, and I ended up asking him. I was going to ask him about Congo, and Rwanda, but I ended up asking him about the genocide in Gaza, and his response was good on that. Um, and part of the reason I didn't end up asking him, I had two questions and a long, complicated dynamic. But the person in front of me asked Dallaire about the M23, and I caught it, I'm going to post it on to my Twitter and elsewhere in the coming days as part of writing this article. And the guy in front of me said, "Has your opinion of Rwanda changed since the M23 movement emerged in the Congo?" And Dallaire's response was, quote, "No, because the M23 is but one group who are trying to save the lives of Tutsis, who are Congolese Tutsis, while the Kinshasa government has a dozen or so rebel forces and so on who are slaughtering them. So the M23 are defending. And then the philosophy of Kagame has always been one to be on the offensive. So he's not going to be waiting to cross the border into his country, waiting for them to cross the border into his country to fight. He's going to sort them out on the other side. So he's simply continuing to get rid of the threat of extremists in the Congolese side and the Rwandan extremists who are there in the Congo still, and this is in, I think he says nurturing the elimination of the Tutsis." Okay, so this is Romeo Dallaire, 31 years after the end of the genocidal killings of 94, still basically justifying Paul Kagame's horrors in Congo on the grounds that there are forces that want to target Tutsis in eastern Congo. And this is a position that's no longer, the Globe Mail does not adhere to this. Financial Times does not adhere to this. I mean, they all used to adhere to this, but basically nobody serious adheres to the notion that this is just Kagame defending Rwanda from the genocidaire and the like, which is essentially what um, Dallaire is still arguing 31 years later. This is remarkable, remarkable. I mean, there are pockets. It's fascinating to watch this. There's pockets in Eastern Anglophone, so Uganda, Kenya, and obviously Rwanda, uh, apologists for the horrors in the Congo that echo variations of this line. Um, in the French language world, it's not that's not widely uh, claimed. But this is serious Kagame propaganda, and his Dallaire Institute, which is for child soldiers, which is based in Kigali, or it's in Dalhousie, but its Africa office is in Kigali. I went looking on their site, and they're all over, all kinds of ties to Rwandan military. They get tons of Canadian government money. They train, they work with the Rwandan military. Rwandan military, the UN says, has been using child soldiers in Eastern Congo. The whole point of the Dallaire Institute was to combat child soldiers. They have a statement. Dallaire has a statement on him and the co-executive director of Dallaire Institute on their site about it was posted clearly the last couple days. I saw it a day ago or so. And it's this issue. It's not as crazy a propaganda as what he said to the person in front of me at 2 months ago. But it's this sort of wishy-washy. He doesn't mention Rwandan forces in Congo. And so really, Dallaire has been a preeminent um, apologist for Kagame's crimes and Rwanda's crimes in Congo, but he's basically his whole story is an apology for Rwanda's crimes. In effect, his whole story of this really simplistic description of what happened in Rwanda in '94, denying. I mean, like I've said previously, Dallaire supported the RPF as they invaded from Rwanda. He enabled their violence in from Uganda, should I say? He enabled their violence in Rwanda and enabled them to ultimately conquer the country. Now, Dallaire or the RPF or RPA, you want to call it that, they blew up the plane that unleashes the mass killing. Um, that that is what triggers, if you like, the genocidal killing. And so Dallaire's gone along with this whole story that still 31 years later he's claiming that Rwanda's involved in Congo defensively, even though Rwanda marched all the way to Kinshasa in 96 or 97, 96, 97. They overthrew the sitting president Mobutu. They then reinvaded. They've had endless opportunity to get the former genocidaire. There's all kinds of evidence that when UN forces have captured people, former Hutu extremists, they and given them to the Rwandans let them go, and they send them back to Eastern Congo. It's a pretext. It's always been a pretext to loot, and it's a big looting economy. They've been looting from Eastern Congo for decades and decades. It's well documented. And so yeah, so Canada's been Dallaire specifically, but Canada in supporting Kagame and Rwanda has a not insignificant role in the horrors, the utter horrors that have befallen on the Congolese. And like I said, we are in a situation where this could very well lead to something that happened, 20 years ago or whatever, in a multi-country war, which left millions dead. And it would be in large part because of Rwanda Kagame's rule, but also because countries like Canada have propped up this individual who apparently won 99.1% of the vote in the last election. The foreign interference inquiry came down this week on Tuesday, I believe it was, and they ultimately basically sort of a nothing burger was what came out of it all. And Commissioner Ugg or Justice Ugg, um, they say, I'll quote part of this. Although there are a very small number of isolated cases where foreign interference may have had some impact on the outcome of a nomination contest or the result of an election in a given riding, there is no evidence to suggest that our institutions have been seriously affected by such interference or that parliamentarians owe their successful election to foreign entities. While any attempted interference is troubling, I am reassured by the minimal impact such efforts have had to date. Nor have I seen any evidence of traitors in Parliament plotting with foreign states to act against Canada. Although a few cases involving things like attempts to curry favor with parliamentarians have come to light, the phenomenon remains marginal and largely ineffective. I am not aware of any federal legislation, regulations, or policies that have been enacted or repealed on account of foreign interference. While the state's attempts are troubling and there is some concerning conduct by parliamentarians, there is no cause for widespread alarm. Fortunately, I did not come across a situation where a parliamentarian decided not to speak out or expressed an opinion that was not really their own out of fear of reprisals from foreign actors. However, I attribute this to the courage of our elected officials because the risk is real, particularly given the potential for retaliatory disinformation campaigns in foreign states. So basically, poured cold water on years of media freakout. That, of course, former Governor General Johnson said there was no need for a public inquiry. The media decided that was out of, not correct, demanded it. The opposition parties went along with the what was ultimately an anti-China frenzy, and now we have this inquiry, huge inquiry, and doesn't come up with hardly anything. Now that doesn't stop the forces like people like Mohamed Tadi from the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project from just putting a long statement denouncing um, uh, the Justice Ugg, the Globe and Mail editorial board. The Ugg report keeps us in the dark. A number of Globe and Mail continue with this story of foreign interference, which they are the main source of this whole frenzy. And so this is really damning for the Globe and Mail. Jenny Kwan, the NDP critic on the matter, Vancouver MP, she posts in response, Commissioner Ugg's final report is a wake-up call and reinforces the need for action. The threat posed by foreign interference to Canada's democratic institutions and processes is real. It is now time for the federal government and all parties to act. So she basically ignores the thrust of the conclusion and just says, oh, it's a big problem, and just repeats the same mantra. Um, so I wrote a piece saying that the commissioner's report suggests we need to have a inquiry into the foreign forces that pushed this foreign interference inquiry. In other words, the U.S. aligned intelligence agencies and the U.S. funded groups like Disinfowatch at Macdonald Laurier and Mehmet Tati's various organizations who are getting funding from the U.S. Government. That's the real inquiry that we need. This inquiry was reflective of foreign interference. It was reflective of U.S. power and U.S. pushing Canada towards its anti-China freakout. Now, of course, the inquiry. I did an interview with Dimitri Lascaris on this, and he points out that Israel doesn't come up at all in the final report, and the U.S. is sort of mentioned in one section, um, but uh, but yeah, so it just kind of confirms more or less what we've been saying, which is there's not a whole lot here, and it's a freak out that's designed to principally target China. Now, of course, there's real effects of all this, though. The Bill C-70, which is quite threatening to civil liberties, it was passed in record time, 6 weeks of unprecedented a claim that there was this foreign interference scare that was, targeting us all and the like. Um, so there is, real consequences. The Green Party apparently they announced that leadership candidates should have CSIS screening, um, which may be designed to sort of basically to give Elizabeth May and the party leadership control over who could run, and obviously they would CSIS would probably not okay Dimitri Lascaris's candidacy. They might also not okay Alex Terrell, the Green leader of the Green Party of Quebec's candidacy, and that's a interesting play by the Green Party to give power to the an intelligence agency that's known for not necessarily being the most ethical institution, to say the least. Uh, Now, the foreign interference, what the main issue, and I think the foreign interference inquiry coming down at this point is relevant, is useful because we are, of course, in this time of this hyper foreign interference and threats, and Donald Trump's threats to annex Canada. And and that's the biggest U.S. interference is, of course, far and away the biggest interference that we should be concerned about. And that's not the concern of those pushing for the inquiry. Now, on that front, we've seen a whole bunch of Canada conceding to these threats from Donald Trump. This notion or this plan to Globe Mail business section headline: Ottawa considers border czar to address U.S. demands. So we need to have a border czar. I think they like to have in the States, I guess, to just, our border. It's so much worry about our border. Um, and apparently the plan is to have a former chief of the defense staff, so somebody that the Americans can trust. I think they mentioned Wayne Ears as the potential candidate. The Americans can trust because, of course, the Americans always know the chiefs of defense staff. Actually, almost all of Canada's chiefs of defense staff have been trained. I go over this in the book, in my military book. I think all but like one of the past seven have been at that is it Fort Leavenworth, the major U.S. officer training facility. I think it's actually the one in Texas. Um, but uh, but so yeah, chiefs of defense staff are, well known to their U.S. counterparts and are trustworthy people, and so that's who the business community is suggesting should be take up this new position to because the ruling class has a Trump uh, appeasement syndrome, the Trump appeasement syndrome. And obviously we're talking about this military spending as part of this Trump appeasement syndrome that's gripped the Canadian ruling class. You have Bill Blair saying that we could get to 2% of GDP on the military by 2027. So in 2 years, that would be a radical, drastic increase in military spending. Almost for sure, uh, like doesn't make sense institutionally. The institution can't actually handle that kind of new resources quickly. It will be very inefficient. Most likely, that was even their position until like a few months, 6 weeks ago, a month ago. That was Bill Blair's position. We need to take a bit longer. It'll take 7 years, I think, is the plan. But now they're suggesting to really appease Trump, we can do this right away. Conrad Black is saying we got to get up to 3% of GDP. Apparently, Lithuania, according to Financial Times story, Lithuania and Estonia have vowed to hit the the U.S. Trump's new 5% GDP plan. So they're saying they're going to get to the 5%. So we're seeing this dynamic play out now. Um, this is, of course, we're funding the increased military spending, not because it's defending Canada, and the and we should say in the context again, Trump's threats, but also Fox News commentator a few weeks ago stated this guy's apparently has like 3 million viewers. He stated the fact that they don't want us to take them over, referring to Canada, makes me want to invade. I want to quench my imperialist thirst. This is a Fox News commentator talking about invading Canada. And the Le Devoir had a piece. They had a whole series of pieces on the weekend, Saturday's paper, mostly saying, how we have to get to the 2% and we got to, make Trump happy by increasing military spending and this and that. That was kind of the thrust of it. But within that, they quote a couple military individuals who these professors who state some interesting points that we knew, but they stated in slightly different ways. So one says, nos forces sont conçues comme des briques Lego qui s'imbriquent dans une autre pièce. So our forces are set up like a Lego piece that fits into another piece, right? So basically they like fit into a US brigade or another NATO force brigade. Um, to patch the holes. So he's stating that the Canadian military, what they've ordered, the equipment, this and that, is all structured to basically just be an added Lego piece of the U.S. empire. And then they quote Philippe Lagacé, who's a prominent Norman Paterson School, Carleton Norman Paterson School, establishment, foreign policy, a person. He says, on a gagé que les États-Unis n'allaient jamais se retourner contre nous. We bet that the U.S. would never turn against us. That means that we're not prepared if the U.S. decided we are no longer a reliable ally. Okay, now this is a fascinating. I found this a fascinating quote. So he's saying that military is structured to basically, support the U.S. military. But then when he says that, like, if the Americans turned on us, the framing he frames it as like totally from the standpoint of U.S. power. So if they turned on us, it's because we would no longer be a fiable, reliable ally. We would no longer be a reliable ally, right? So if the U.S. was to invade, he's essentially setting up the terrain. So if the U.S. was to invade, it's because we were no longer a reliable ally. That's sort of the kind of thinking underpinning. Well, he couldn't just say that, like, well, the U.S. and Donald Trump might invade just because they have a manifest destiny, just because it's an imperialist country, just because they're expansionist or whatever. You can't sort of go that far. He can state a little bit about how the Canadian military is not really structured to defend Canada, but can't take that next step. Um, Now the on Tuesday or on Saturday night, the okay, actually one other thing in terms of the Trump appeasement syndrome that's gripping the ruling class. So part of that, as I detailed in this piece I published a day or two ago, the is this they bashing China, right? I think I probably talked about this last week. A whole bunch more bashing China as part of their oh Trump, don't attack us, we'll bash China with you kind of dynamic. Okay, now in the National Post on Saturday, the columnist says under no circumstances should Canada's response to US President Donald Trump's tariff war include expanding economic ties with the People's Republic of China. There is no political or moral gain to be had from that, and any short term economic gain could have disastrous consequences in the long run. So basically, one of our main bargaining chips in a trade war with the US is just like we gotta under no circumstances should we talk about increasing trade with China. So basically, because China's bad, they're the immoral way. And then you go, well, what's the U.S. done, right? Stole all the land, enslaved millions of Africans, stole half of Mexico, uh, stole Hawaii, how many wars, how many coups, how many billions for this recent genocide. So it's moral to trade with the U.S. It's immoral to trade with China because it's China is so bad. Um, so this is the Trump appeasement syndrome that's gripped the ruling class. But of course, the facts of what Trump's done is overwhelming, right? It is overwhelming that here we are. We've done as much as any country to support the U.S. empire, and the beast is turning on us. So the ruling class reaction is mostly just to keep feeding the beast, but in again they need to respond in some way pushing back. And so they've obviously announced some tariffs in response. On Saturday night, Trudeau gave a speech. I didn't watch the speech, but according to Chantal Hébert, the CBC, Toronto Star, Le Devoir columnist, uh, this is the first time she's claiming it's the first time in Canadian history where a Canadian Prime Minister has kind of had a public oppositional speech directed to a U.S. president. And she's sort of saying this is unprecedented. It's going to have massive ramifications. We'll see where all this plays out, depending on how far Trump pushes it and stuff like that. But no doubt things have rattled, and there is some hint of breaking away from the U.S. empire, which that speech would sort of indicate. Now, within that speech, Trump or Trudeau, should I say, doubled down on the appeasement of Trump or the U.S. empire. He stated, "From the beaches of Normandy to the mountains of the Korean Peninsula, from the fields of Flanders to the streets of Kandahar, Afghanistan, we have fought and died alongside you during your darkest hours." So that was part of Trudeau's speech, and he a couple hours ago he posted that clip to his Twitter account. So they're really trying to hype that one up. So they're boasting about Canada fighting in well, World War One we didn't fight because of the Americans, or even World War Two. That was really following the British. World War One, of course, was a total utter insanity. World War Two, a bit more complicated story. The only war, in my opinion, you can make is justifiable in Canadian history. Korea and Afghanistan are, of course, not. Those were because of the U.S. You cannot make that. You can't. Those were not justifiable. But Trudeau this was the darkest hours. 1950 was the darkest hours for the U.S. We had to send troops to Korea. Otherwise, what would have happened, right? Yeah. Um, so I think we're in a situation where and I just did an interview with Sam Gindin, just posted it to CFPI YouTube. I'm going to post it to mine tomorrow. That this is the task here is we have some space to push, to break away, to delink from the US and the US empire. There is some space here. That is what Trump has, uh, you know, rattled the established imperial order. And so I think we need to be pushing this stuff, pushing, the Jeremy Appel on Twitter pointed out a couple of days ago that he was something to the effect of a whole lot of people just learned about U.S. imperialism. So all these people who they're feeling that the US is targeting us, and now it's like, oh, Americans are bad and whatever, but they hadn't clued in on let's just say a few different examples of US bullying and whatnot around the world. But nonetheless, political dynamics offer opportunities, and I think we should be pushing that at this moment, talking about the ugly American, delinking from the U.S. empire, even though, of course, Trudeau's thing is performative and not really, he's obviously not, doesn't mean it, but there's some space to push that way. Shifting gears to the Palestine question, and there's just so much developments here. global affairs, really, honestly. Um, Polyev, a couple things on Polyev. He did a speech to a Vancouver synagogue. That was the Tyee did a story kind of about it, raising concerns, right, raises concerns. Now, a couple things he said. I'm not sure if he said it at this synagogue or where he said this, but he said that we must deport any temporary resident who is here on a permanent or a visa who are carrying out violence or hate crimes on our soil. So he's really referencing this business that Trump's pushed about, deporting uh, uh, activists that oppose the genocide who might not have full full status. And he had the his he spoke in front of a podium that said "deport the terrorists." I think was Poilievre spoke for it. He also said, in reference to Anthony Housefather, he said, "You vote." So you did an event in the riding West Montreal, the riding. I'm forgetting the name of the riding right now. Um, he said, "You vote for Anthony Housefather, then you get the Hamas wing of the Liberal Party. That's what you get. They go together. They're a package deal. The good news is there's no Hamas wing in the Conservative Party." So basically, and oh, this was on Holocaust. So yeah, Housefather complained this was on the 80th anniversary of Auschwitz anniversary, and this is what Polyev said. And I posted about my solidarity with Housefather. How dare he be associated with those opposing the genocide in Gaza? He's been a staunch supporter, uh, but uh, but so Boliev is really ramping up this extreme rhetoric on Palestine. I think this is going to end up turning Poliev's not. I don't think Poliev's going to win this next election. I think what's happening with the U.S. is going to totally change the political map, and Poliev is got himself caught in a tough spot, and his doubling down on the extremist Palestine stuff is not going to end up helping him in the end here. It seems like it helps. It's good with splitting off more and more of the Jewish community. It has some fundraising benefits. It riles up some of this really hard base of white supremacist sort of anti-immigrant base that he's got. I don't know, kind of the trucker convoyish kind of world crowd. It plays to this kind of dynamic, and it was useful for the conservatives in terms of splitting the liberals. That was splitting the Liberal Party. There's still some value in that, but I think it's ultimately going to be a failed strategy. A couple more bits on the Palestine. Some of the Jeremy Levy, the mayor of Hampstead, the fascistic kind of language coming out of these people. The time for polite diplomacy is over. The Quebec government must take a hard line and crush the vile anti-Semitism festering in some of our schools. He wants them to crush. He wants them basically to bring in these draconian legislation around universities who allow students to oppose genocide. Um, the sort of that fascistic element that's just been really brought to the fore uh, in response to the popular uprising against the genocide is quite a sight to behold. Um, Couple things. So apparently, I-24 Israeli TV news is now on all kinds is on Rogers like package. You get I guess you have like a news package, and apparently this far right Israeli TV station news station is on it. Apparently one of the Aspers in Winnipeg is behind getting this onto the Rogers. I don't know more detail. I just got this in an email from somebody who apparently looked into this, and there's a campaign targeting that. On the media front, CJPME posted that the CBC editors refuse to refer to Honest Reporting Canada as a pro-Israel group. So they just say it's a media advocacy group. They won't even admit after all this that it's a pro-Israel group. The On the note of the fascist tenets, or the authoritarian, maybe better putting this. So the University of Windsor came to an agreement with students. The CJ is going to court, suing them over this agreement, saying it's anti-Semitic. I don't know, if there's any merit to its legal case, or if it's just a public relations stunt. But just the fact that they keep pushing this. The National Post published this huge long article on Saturday documenting the sexual violence of October 7th. And this person, she spoke in Toronto from Israeli University. I think she spoke yesterday or something like that. And it's a big, long, huge interview. And it's all that, there's this basically, she admits that there's not really any victims. Um, but they have to compile evidence in different ways. There's these like subtle admissions that there's nothing here that would hold up in a court of law. Um, uh, but because there is no name, right? There's no name of a victim. And actually, a couple of days ago, one of the Israelis that were captive in Gaza that was released, she said that the rape was doesn't claim to have been raped, and no, none of them come out claim to be raped. But she says that the some Palestinian militant stared at her regularly, and she says that was basically rape. And it's one of those ones where I actually think it's, there's a truth in the fact that staring can be, and it maybe is usually a form of sexual. Let's call it sexual assault. Call it sexual assault in a sense. Um, uh, but it's clearly not what's being referred to in this big picture here of like the mass rapes and all this business, right? It's not like some guy staring at, I'm sure she was made nervous by it, made uncomfortable by it, not totally, but it's obviously many steps away from what's being used to justify slaughtering Palestinians, which is what the whole rape story has been about. The Globe and Mail published on Saturday their editor, the what do they call it? The not the editor, the reader's editor or something like that. And basically the protest that took place 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, and then the letter writing campaign where she says 2,200 people emailed the Globe complaining about their coverage. And so she did a whole column justifying the Globe's coverage and saying, "Oh, we published this Palestinian and da da da. We're both sides have been criticizing us, and the pro-Israel folk criticize us for not using the word terrorist and da 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 whatever." Right. So that's a sign of clearly it's rattling a little bit within the Globe and Mail structure. The Giller Foundation cut ties, that was reported today, with the Scotiabank. And then, of course, there's been a big campaign on that. And then just a couple of things I'll mention. There's a event, No Nickel for Genocide, uh, Nickel and the U.S. War Machine event. The people in Sudbury are organizing that on February 6th, online event. As a rally, as part of this ongoing, I see tomorrow in Toronto, there's a rally against the attacks in Jenin. And at Montreal on Thursday at 3:30 at Concordia, there's a rally about the Board of Governors. Cut ties with Zionism is the headline. So there was protests here in Montreal this weekend. I think almost 150 people marched. I think there's still been rallies in other cities, so protests continue. And I think, I mentioned this last week. I think there is a real possibility of bringing together the popular forces that have been opposing the genocide with this broader layer that's seeing the ugly American. And I think it's deeper, of course, because it's felt as, economic impact on us and that kind of stuff. Um, the the Council of Canadians has this pledge for Canada statement they put out. It's not very good. It's sort of going a little bit in, sort of this nationalistic kind of response to Trump stuff. which I think is good to have that start building some degree of response. Unfortunately, the Council of Canadians is could be the vehicle, an important vehicle for bringing together the sort of left nationalist, no to the ugly American with the Palestine popular forces. Unfortunately, they've been completely absent in the mobilization of Palestine, so they're not going to be well placed on that. Um, but yeah, I think there is some opportunity here. I'm gonna leave it at that and go ahead, Yuri, and I'm gonna make Laura a co-host. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me, Eve?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, first of all, thanks for all the work you do on Congo and constantly covering and speaking out on Rwanda. Not many people do that, so I really, really appreciate you doing that. My two questions, though, which are unrelated to Congo, is did you get the chance to read what's his name? Did you get the chance to read Travis Ross's article on Haiti and how apparently Fanny Lavalas, the once mighty leftist party led by Jean-Bertrand Aristide and its network of folks, have apparently been pivoting to the right? And Arnold August did an article on Trudeau's term and his legacy for Black Agenda reports. But an issue to pick with Arnold, in which he was comparing Justin Trudeau to his dad's legacy, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and he was sort of lionizing how great Pierre Trudeau was when it comes to détente with China and Cuba. But isn't that actually a myth that for some reason a lot of Canadian anti-war and anti-imperialist voices keep doing when they keep describing Pierre Trudeau as this, as this sort of besties with China and Cuba, despite. Yeah, I'm just curious your response on those two.
Yeah, well, no, I think that on Cuba it's real. I mean, his, the story about why Canada doesn't break relations with Cuba, that's the broader story that is ignored, which is the whole spying question. But Pierre Trudeau, I think, it was a going there and stuff was substantive. So I think that I didn't on China. I haven't delved into Pierre Trudeau's role on China um, that closely. So yeah, so he does. It is obviously him because it's in 70 or 71 where Canada shifts and starts recognizing China at the UN. Yeah, so that is Pierre Trudeau. I haven't really kind of looked at that question that significantly. But I think he does deserve some credit on that. I think Pierre Trudeau did. He also backed away a bit on Vietnam from certainly from what Lester Pearson, where Lester Pearson was. Lester Pearson was, of course, staunch backer. Uh, so I think it would be fair to say, that's not to say that Pietro wasn't good on South Africa, wasn't good on East Timor and um so
Uganda, of course,
yeah,
and
yeah,
Congo.
or the coup in Chile, Pinochet and stuff like that. So it's not like Pierre Trudeau was like an anti-American or whatever, right? But there was a bit more. He was less. Without having gone fully in, obviously I followed Justin Trudeau's foreign policy closely. Without having gone fully in on Pierre Trudeau, I would say it's pretty hard to argue that Justin Trudeau is not a qualitatively more pro-US empire than his father was. I think that to me is
Based in Pierre Elliott Trudeau's relations with Cuba, just like all the other, it's just like all the other prime ministers in which he sort of is spying on Cuba. So yeah, Canadians can go tour Cuba, and on paper, Canada has good relations with Cuba, but it's more or less like they're spying on on Cuba and like feeding like dirt to the Americans for them to
Yeah,
continue crippling sanctions and whatnot, right?
but I think that like that was happening since the Cuban Revolution, and and what Pierre Trudeau did is he went down and he met with Fidel, and I think it was the first, was it the first NATO country or first G7 leader to go down? I think maybe first NATO country to meet, and it was, so there was, that was real. I mean, that was a substantive, had a big impact on, I think, breaking Cuban isolation and stuff like, right? So yeah, um, I don't think it should be, exaggerated as as again that he was like, fighting the U.S. empire all over the world or anything like that. But it was some signs of independence. Um, so yeah, I think that those differences. Now there was the other question was the other article. Yeah, the Family Lavas. I read that piece, and I don't know. I don't know enough to like to know. I don't think that my reading of Family Lavalas, and I know this, I haven't, and I say this tentatively here, but there was always the Petit Desailly with Moïse Jean Charles, who I met back in 2004, who at that point was no, I met him in 2007. So I say he wasn't, at that point he was in sort of he had gone into hiding. I guess by that point he was probably out of hiding. Yeah. So, but I think he was in still some degree of kind of danger. But they broke, the Petit Desailly broke from Famille Lavalas, and they framed it as to the left. And I know there were people who said that Petit Desailly was like basically funded by the oligarchs because there's always, if you look at that was a big battle we had after the coup, which was that the groups like Bataille Ouvrière, the worker struggle, which was this sort of like critic of Aristide from the left, that Aristide had sold out to the capitalists and stuff like that, and they ended up being funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, and they denied it. They denied it, and finally it was actually confirmed. And it was, so there's all these anarchists here in Montreal and across North America who were taking their position as like, oh, Aristide was not a leftist and da 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 da, sort of like effectively justifying the coup from the left. And so obviously to divide Famille Lavalas, so there was the idea that it was sectors of the bourgeoisie, the oligarchs in Haiti, that were basically funding Petit Desailly to break off of Famille Lavalas, because to have a radical left that to cause division and all this stuff served a political purpose. I don't know if that any of that is true, and I've seen that Moise Jean Charles has done some things that I consider very odd since then, so that um, gives more credence to that idea. But my impression was that Famille Lavalas was always is pretty um, conservative political kind of disposition, right? It was like it was a pro poor, and it clearly was a mass. I mean, Aristide is he is the most popular politician in the country's history, or certainly at least since Dessalines or Toussaint Louverture. But it's a pretty kind of conservative kind of, yeah. But I don't know enough to know whether Travis's piece is correct or not. But yeah.
So I have a question, Eve, just about how people in Canada are perceiving what Trump is really doing. Because I think it seems to me pretty clear that it's got nothing to do with the border and fentanyl. In fact, Democracy Now!, I think it was today, they cited how much had actually been intercepted going from Canada to the US, and it was negligible. And they said that actually it appeared that there had been more intercepted going the other way to Canada from the US. But I don't know, from my reading, it looks to me like what he's trying to accomplish, one is just to get more of these industries to go to the US, and two, to try and get Canada to buy more from the US, particularly from weapons manufacturers. I mean, I think this whole thing of the border just seems artificial and fake to me. And I'm just wondering how in the press and people, what you think of it, and what do you think his real motivation is?
I think there's like I've read stories from people saying all over the map,
Yeah.
right? This business story a few days ago in the Globe front page. This is actually all about China. It's some strategy to like then go at China, like cow the allies into then supporting his anti-China thing. I don't know. That seemed
Well, I don't even understand the logic there. What is that? I don't even get the argument.
yeah, it seemed like a bizarre argument to me. It's like the first phase is to cow all the allies and it's all it doesn't didn't make much sense to me either. Um, the yeah, fentanyl thing seems very minimal. So um, does he is it actually does he actually see the tariffs as a revenue generator? Like he keeps saying that, right? I think there's no doubt that the military spending increase is a desired goal.
Mhm.
That seems clear, and lots and lots of people in the Canadian ruling class are totally ecstatic that Trump is, playing rough on that issue.
Is
Uh,
that because, but do you think it's because Trump just wants us to buy more American and invest more in the US
Well, I think
military?
but I think yeah, I think like that point I made many times that every added dollar to the Canadian military is an added dollar to the U.S. War machine, both because the Canadian military assists the U.S. military around the world, and because much of the contractors are branch plants of General Dynamics Canada, Lockheed Martin Canada, Boeing Canada. So many of much of the contracts go to these U.S. firms that have operations in Canada. So all of the political structure in the US has always called for more Canadian military spending, and Trump is just, taking that and pushing it even further. So I think that that's all straightforward. And also, like, the NSA wants and the FBI want more, they're so integrated with the RCMP and the Communication Security Establishment and CSIS. So more money to those, the intelligence agencies and whatever security forces is sort of a boon to the U.S. as well, to U.S. agencies as well, through like the Five Eyes and stuff like that. Um, so I think that that's he today he brought up banks, right? So he brought up one thing he said that the U.S. banks. And he's like totally right, right? Canadian banks have a huge chunk of the US banking, but US banks are not allowed in Canada. And so he's complaining about that. And I'm sure I haven't actually, it's not an issue I've seen like talked about, kind of somewhat surprisingly thinking about it.
Is that true? I thought I read the op there. You sure that's true?
Well,
Like what Canadian banks? I think the Royal Bank of Canada. I never see Canadian banks down here.
oh yeah, TD. The TD is a top.
Mhm.
TD just had a huge. They just got sued for like $3 billion for their corrupt practices in the U.S. No, no.
Mhm.
TD is a big player. I think there's two Canadian banks that are among the top 10 in the U.S. Maybe it's the top 15. You actually see TD. Like in Chicago, they actually even use the brand of TD. I think most of it is they bought up other U.S. banks and they're still
Oh,
called whatever U.S. bank name.
no, I see.
But so that is, and the same thing with like telecommunications. You don't see the banking thing, but I'm sure the banks. I mean, it makes total sense that American banks are angry about that. I mean, why wouldn't they want to have the ability to, be players in Canada? That's obviously a lost market from their standpoint. Um, and the one you see, the one that's brought up the most is the whole dairy, right? The supply management dairy system and American dairy farmers and that's because they really dislike that from it's not even that capitalized. Canada's dairy is not that capitalized, so it's not even these big corporations. So they really hate that and they go at that. So Trump's probably trying to break on that. He's trying to get Canada to concede on that. I don't know if he's the telecommunications, U.S. telecommunications companies would want, and they have gotten broken in a little bit to Canadian, but they're mostly still blocked. Um, so I think that would be desired by power sources in the U.S. But I agree. I sort of agree with you. I don't know, like I have no doubt that I don't know. Is it a third? Is it half? Is it 80% of this is literally just Donald Trump like likes to be like the boss and to like sort of show how he's they'll cow to me, and I think there's no doubt. Maybe it's only 25%. There's no doubt about this. Really, just comes down to literally like Donald Trump's like disposition of that kind of stuff. How much of it is a U.S. ruling class strategy or a sector of the U.S. ruling class's strategy to get more from other NATO countries, to get more from out of Canada's economy. I don't know. I don't know how much. It is hard to tell. Um, it seems like a poor management of the U.S. empire. It seems like pretty clearly poor, and even poor management of U.S. Global capitalism. Though I do think, as you pointed out, that there are some effect of this is to get more Canadian companies to set up shop in the States, and some effect of this is to get more U.S. companies that may be operating in Canada to move away from that. So it can benefit some important elements of U.S. Capital, but it certainly kind of throws into question the whole neoliberal globalization project. But that's sort of been thrown into question with China and to some extent as well. It doesn't seem like also, that's another thing, and it doesn't seem like a very good strategy as part of the target China project that the U.S. empire is doing. But it sort of has worked a little bit on that front, even because the most of the Canadian ruling circles are saying they've added to their bash China kind of thinking. So I don't really know.
Well, I think that I was listening to something today. They were talking about how the US, it's not that other countries, like, it's not just they're not buying from the US, although sometimes the US isn't selling anything they want, but it's also the US spends like a drunken sailor, like racking up huge debt ratio to GDP. And they can do that because of their printing power, printing money. And so the expectation that other countries will do that as well, that might be a little more responsible in terms of how they're spending. I mean, that's ridiculous too. So we should all go in debt so we can, you know, spend vast amount of money on things that we maybe don't need, like the military.
Yeah.
Anyway, I
Yeah.
think that's it. I don't see any other questions. So unless anybody else has a question, I think we can let you
Thanks,
go.
everyone.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thanks everybody. It was a good session.
Thanks.